He is not playing games with you. He is running a test, and most people fail it without even realizing the exam had already started. If you have ever felt like an avoidant partner suddenly became distant, moody, or strangely difficult for no clear reason, stay with me for the next few minutes because what looks like random behavior is actually a hidden test, and I'm about to show you exactly what he is really checking for. By the end of this video, you will know the 5 specific ways avoidant partners test the people they are falling for, what each test is actually measuring underneath the surface, and what your reaction to each one reveals about where the relationship is really heading. Before we go further, comment the word tested below if you have ever felt like you were being quietly evaluated without knowing the rules of the exam. That one word tells me you are paying attention, and it helps this video reach more people who are trying to understand the same confusing behavior right now. Now, here is something important. Comment the word tested right now if any of what is coming already sounds familiar. Type it exactly like that, just the one word, tested. It takes 2 seconds and it keeps this information circulating to the people who actually need to hear it before the algorithm buries it. Let us slow down for a second and talk about why avoidant people test partners in the first place, because understanding the reason behind it completely changes how you interpret what is happening. Avoidant attachment usually forms early in life, often in environments where trust was inconsistent, where emotional needs were sometimes met and sometimes ignored, teaching a child that people cannot always be relied upon the way they should be. That child grows into an adult who craves connection like everyone else, but who has also learned, often without ever consciously deciding to, that connection needs to be verified before it can be trusted. Testing becomes an unconscious safety mechanism. It is not manipulation in the calculated, deliberate sense most people assume. It is closer to an old survival instinct running quietly in the background, checking again and again whether this particular person is actually safe to fully open up to, or whether they will eventually behave the way earlier important people in his life once did. These 5 tests are not games designed to trip you up. They are questions his nervous system is asking, long before his conscious mind has the words to ask them directly. Number 1. The sudden withdrawal test. This is often the very first test an avoidant partner runs, and it usually happens early, right around the point where things start feeling genuinely good between you. Communication has been steady, emotional closeness has been building, and then, seemingly out of nowhere, he pulls back. Texts slow down, enthusiasm fades. Plans that once felt automatic suddenly require more effort to schedule. Most people interpret this as losing interest, and sometimes that interpretation is correct. But very often, especially when the withdrawal follows a period of real closeness, rather than following months of already fading interest, this sudden distance is functioning as a test, whether he is fully aware of it or not. What is actually being measured here is your reaction to space. Does space send you into panic, into chasing, into anxious messages demanding explanation? Or can you tolerate the distance with some grace, giving him room without disappearing entirely yourself, without abandoning your own life and self-respect in the process? Avoidants are watching closely, even if they never admit it, to see whether closeness with you feels safe, or whether it feels like something that will trap them the moment they try to breathe. Your response to this first test often sets the tone for how the entire relationship unfolds from that point forward. Your response to this first test often sets the tone for how the entire relationship unfolds from that point forward. It helps to look closely at the timing of this particular withdrawal, because timing is often the biggest clue separating a genuine test from a genuine loss of interest. If the pulling back arrives shortly after a specific moment of real closeness, a meaningful conversation, an especially warm date, a moment where he said or did something that revealed more of himself than usual, that timing strongly suggests the withdrawal is a fear response to intimacy rather than a sign of fading interest. Genuine disinterest tends to build slowly and steadily over time, without a clear triggering moment of closeness right before it. Fear-driven withdrawal tends to arrive suddenly, almost like a reflex, immediately following whatever moment made the relationship start to feel real and therefore risky. Learning to notice this timing pattern can save you enormous amounts of unnecessary anxiety because it lets you distinguish between a relationship that is genuinely ending and a relationship that is simply moving through a completely normal, if uncomfortable, part of the avoidant attachment cycle. Number 2, the emotional distance test. This test looks similar to the first on the surface but operates differently underneath. Instead of physical withdrawal like fewer texts or less initiated contact, this test shows up as emotional flatness while he is still physically present. He might still show up, still respond, still go through the motions of the relationship, but something feels colder, more guarded, harder to reach. He might become vague about his feelings right after a moment of real vulnerability occurred between you, almost retreating from the intimacy he himself just revealed. This is often an unconscious check to see how you handle emotional unavailability specifically, separate from physical distance. Do you take his coldness personally and match it with coldness of your own, creating a standoff neither of you can easily walk back from? Do you get anxious and start over explaining yourself, apologizing for things that were never actually your fault, trying to talk your way back into his warmth? Or do you stay steady, present, warm without being desperate, giving him room to come back toward emotional closeness on his own timeline rather than being pulled or pushed there? Avoidants are quietly measuring whether emotional coldness from them creates chaos in you, or whether you can remain grounded even when he temporarily cannot meet you fully. Notice too that this test often repeats in cycles rather than appearing once and resolving permanently. Each time you respond with steadiness instead of chaos, the cycle tends to shorten slightly, the coldness lifting a little faster than it did the time before. This gradual shortening is worth tracking over the span of months rather than days, since any single instance can look identical to the last one, even while the overall trend is quietly improving underneath the surface. If this is resonating with you right now, that is exactly why I want you to comment the word tested below. It helps me know these breakdowns are actually landing, and it pushes this video toward more people quietly trying to understand the confusing signals in their own relationship right now. Number 3, the push away then observe test. This is one of the more painful tests to experience because it often involves him saying or doing something that seems designed to create distance, sometimes even something that sounds like rejection, followed immediately by careful, quiet observation of exactly how you respond. He might say something dismissive about the relationship's future. He might mention needing space in a way that feels sudden and unexplained. He might become critical or short-tempered over something minor. And then he watches. Does this push send you spiraling into desperate reassurance seeking, proving through your reaction that his worst fear about closeness, that it always eventually becomes suffocating or overwhelming, was correct all along? Or do you respond with calm clarity, expressing that his behavior was hurtful without collapsing into panic, without begging, without shrinking yourself to accommodate the push? This particular test is often less about whether you stay and more about how you stay, because avoidants are specifically looking for evidence that you can maintain your own emotional stability even when he temporarily behaves in ways that would normally trigger chaos in less secure dynamics. Passing this test does not mean tolerating disrespect. It means responding from groundedness rather than reactivity, holding your own boundaries while still leaving the door open rather than either collapsing entirely or slamming it shut in retaliation. There is a subtle distinction worth naming clearly here because it is easy to confuse groundedness with simply absorbing hurtful behavior without comment. Groundedness does not mean pretending something dismissive or unkind did not affect you. It means addressing it honestly, calmly, and directly without letting the reaction spiral into either desperate pleading or explosive retaliation. A grounded response might sound like naming plainly that a comment felt hurtful, stating clearly what you need going forward, and then allowing space for him to respond without chasing an immediate resolution. This kind of response actually tends to be far more disarming to an avoidant partner than either extreme, because it demonstrates exactly the kind of secure, self-respecting stability that quietly proves his deepest fear about closeness, that it always eventually becomes chaotic or overwhelming, does not apply to you. Number 4, the independence test. This test often shows up more subtly than the others, and it frequently gets misread as him simply being busy or distracted. Watch for moments where he seems to intentionally create space around his own independence, mentioning plans that do not include you, spending time with friends without extending an invitation the way he might have before, or generally asserting his autonomy in small, almost pointed ways. This is rarely about actually wanting less of you specifically. It is usually about checking whether you can tolerate him having a full separate life outside the relationship without becoming possessive, insecure, or resentful about it. Avoidants fear losing themselves inside relationships, a fear that often traces back to earlier experiences where closeness felt like it required abandoning their own needs or identity entirely. When he asserts independence and watches for your reaction, he is essentially asking silently whether loving you will eventually mean losing himself. Do you respond with jealousy, with subtle guilt trips designed to make him feel bad for having a life outside the relationship? Or do you genuinely support his independence, trusting that space for him does not threaten what exists between you? Partners who pass this test, who demonstrate real security around his autonomy rather than performed security masking quiet resentment, often see avoidant partners relax considerably over time, because the fear underneath the test that love will eventually demand the erasure of self slowly gets disproven through lived experience rather than through words alone. It is worth pointing out that this test cuts both directions, and paying attention to your own patterns here matters just as much as understanding his. If you notice yourself feeling quietly threatened every time he mentions independent plans, that reaction is worth examining honestly rather than immediately suppressing or performing calmness you do not actually feel. Sometimes that discomfort points to legitimate concerns worth voicing directly, especially if his independence starts to feel less like healthy autonomy and more like a pattern of consistent unavailability. But often, that discomfort is simply an old fear of your own being activated, a fear that his time away somehow threatens the relationship's stability. Distinguishing between the two, legitimate concern versus reflexive anxiety, is part of what allows you to respond to this particular test with genuine security rather than a performance of security that quietly cracks under repeated pressure. Number 5. The vulnerability reciprocity test. This is often the deepest and most important test of all, and it usually happens after some real trust has already been established. At some point, an avoidant partner will take a genuine risk, sharing something vulnerable, something that cost him real effort to say out loud, whether that is admitting insecurity, sharing a difficult memory, or simply expressing a feeling more directly than his usual guarded communication style allows. What happens immediately afterward matters enormously. Does that vulnerability get met with genuine presence, warmth, and careful attention? Or does it get brushed past quickly, minimized, or unintentionally overshadowed by your own need to immediately respond with your own story, your own feelings, before his moment has even had space to fully land? This is not a test about whether you also share vulnerably. Mutual vulnerability is healthy and necessary in any real relationship. It is specifically about timing and attentiveness in that particular moment. Avoidants who take the risk of opening up are often extremely sensitive, sometimes without even realizing it themselves, to whether that specific act of courage gets honored properly or whether it gets treated casually as though it cost him nothing to say. When vulnerability is met with genuine care, even quietly, even without a big dramatic response, it teaches him something enormously important: that opening up to you specifically does not lead to being dismissed, rushed past, or made to feel foolish for having tried. Small, practical shifts in how you listen during these moments often matter more than grand gestures of support. Slowing down instead of immediately jumping in with advice or comparison. Reflecting back what he actually said before adding your own perspective. Resisting the urge to fill every pause with reassurance, and instead simply letting a quiet moment exist after he has shared something difficult, giving it the weight it deserves, rather than rushing to smooth it over. These small habits communicate something avoidant partners rarely receive elsewhere: that their vulnerability was actually heard, not just tolerated, not just endured until it was your turn to speak again, but genuinely received as something meaningful in its own right. So let us bring these 5 tests together for a moment. The sudden withdrawal test, checking whether space causes chaos in you. The emotional distance test, checking whether coldness from him creates coldness or panic in return. The push away then observe test, checking whether you can stay grounded through a temporary rejection without collapsing or retaliating. The independence test, checking whether his autonomy feels threatening to you or genuinely welcome. And the vulnerability reciprocity test, checking whether his rare moments of openness get honored the way they deserve to be. It is worth being honest about something important here. None of these tests are conscious manipulation in the way the word test might initially suggest. Very few avoidant partners are sitting somewhere deliberately plotting these exact 5 scenarios to run against you. These patterns emerge naturally, instinctively, from a nervous system that learned long ago to verify safety before fully committing to trust. Understanding them as tests simply gives you language for behavior that would otherwise feel confusing, random, or unfair. Once you can see the underlying question behind each behavior, closeness stops feeling like something happening to you unpredictably and starts feeling like something you can respond to with intention and clarity instead of reactive panic. It is also worth saying clearly that you are not required to pass every single one of these tests perfectly in order to build something real with an avoidant partner. Relationships are not pass or fail exams, and reacting imperfectly to distance or coldness once or twice does not doom a connection permanently. What matters far more than any single reaction is the overall pattern over time, whether you generally trend toward groundedness, self-respect, and warmth rather than anxious reactivity, and whether he generally trends towards slowly opening up more rather than staying permanently frozen exactly where he started. Growth on both sides, however gradual and imperfect, tends to matter more than any individual moment either of you gets wrong along the way. There is one more layer worth understanding before we close, and it involves what happens on the other side of these tests when they go well repeatedly over time. Avoidant partners who experience consistent evidence that closeness does not lead to loss of self, that coldness does not get met with retaliation, that vulnerability gets honored rather than dismissed, often begin testing less frequently as the relationship matures. This does not usually happen suddenly. It happens gradually, almost invisibly, as accumulated safe experiences slowly override older fear-based patterns. The relationship starts to feel less like an ongoing exam and more like an actual partnership, not because he became a completely different person, but because enough evidence accumulated that this particular connection genuinely does not carry the risks his nervous system once assumed all closeness inevitably carried. If you are recognizing several of these tests happening in your own relationship right now, use that recognition as clarity rather than as a source of additional anxiety. You do not need to perform perfect responses to every single test from this point forward. You simply need to understand what is actually happening beneath the surface so that distance feels less like abandonment, coldness feels less like rejection, and vulnerability feels like the meaningful invitation it actually is, rather than a confusing mixed signal you have no framework for interpreting. It also helps to remember that you are allowed to have needs of your own throughout this entire process. Understanding why an avoidant partner tests the way he does is not the same as agreeing to endlessly absorb whatever comes your way without ever asking for reassurance or clarity in return. A genuinely healthy dynamic still requires him to eventually meet you part way, communicating more directly over time, rather than relying on unconscious testing indefinitely as the only way closeness gets verified. Understanding his patterns gives you the tools to respond with patience and clarity. It does not obligate you to carry the entire emotional weight of the relationship alone while waiting for a growth that may or may not ever fully arrive. Before you go, one last thing. If this video helped you finally understand the hidden logic behind behavior that used to feel confusing or even a little hurtful, comment the word tested one more time down below. It genuinely helps this reach the people who need it most. People who might be sitting exactly where you were a few minutes ago, wondering why closeness with an avoidant partner sometimes feels like walking through an invisible obstacle course. And if you want the next video where I break down exactly what happens once an avoidant partner finally stops testing and fully lets you in, make sure you are subscribed so you do not miss it, because that one goes even deeper than this. Take care of yourself. Trust what these patterns are actually trying to tell you. And I will see you in the next one, where we go even further into what genuine lasting openness from an avoidant partner actually looks like once the testing phase settles.